My name is Peter Ballant. I was born in Hungary in 1940. I survived the Second World War and the Holocaust, lived in Hungary until 1956 under the communist regime, escaped that year, ended up in Austria. Switzerland accepted us as refugees and lived in Switzerland for 6 months, after which the Australian government accepted us as immigrants and came to Australia in May 1957. From Hungary, close to 600,000 Jews were deported to the extermination camps. A lot of people lost their lives even before arriving at Auschwitz and the other extermination camps. An ex-employee of my father, or rather his wife, decided to hide me as her son and moved to a small village. She did that simply because she believed that that was the right thing to do. Certainly wasn't for money. My father was in a forced labor camp. The commanding officer in the forced labor camp was a very decent person, and he looked after the Jews in the forced labor camp. At one point, the governor of Hungary, Admiral Horthy, wanted a special peace with the Allies. He was found out, and during that short period of time, the commanding officer accepted to have my mother work as a maid and took me with her. So the family was together, my father in the forced labor camp, my mother as a maid, and I was there as a kid running around. So finally the Russians came and liberated the forced labor camp. It's very difficult to describe. If they would have found that she's hiding a Jewish boy, she would have been taken to Auschwitz and probably killed there. No one denounced me, and I survived the war. So after the war, this lady and her husband were really my second parents. And we kept together, we celebrated holidays, we celebrated Christmas together. I have to come back and say again, the risk that she took and her husband, because they were doing it together, is just unbelievable. And I asked the question myself, would I have taken that risk? There is no answer. Subsequently, the communist regime took over in Hungary. They tightened the screws as time went by, and it became a totalitarian country. Anybody who wasn't for the communist regime was against them. My father gave up his business. Initially he had a good job, then he lost one job after another because he wasn't a communist and he wasn't part of the workers, the proletariat that was the core of the communist regime. At one point he was asked to report to the police, and he went to see his Russian boss, and the Russian said, no problem, they just want to ask you a few questions and that's it, and you'll get home. That wasn't the case. He was kept in prison for quite a while. He doesn't know why. Then he was released and he doesn't know why. So life in Hungary was tough. We listened to Radio Free Europe. We listened to the Voice of America. And I still remember, this is the Voice of America, broadcasting all over the world. To listen to Voice of America or Free Europe was a punishable thing to do, and so we had to do it in secret and listened at a very low level, and yet they tried to put a white noise over the broadcast, so it was not easy to understand.
What happened to make your parents leave in 1956.
So October 23, 1956, the revolution broke out. It was started by the university students and the workers and the peasants. The core of the communist regime turned against the communist regime. The Hungarians basically wanted the Russians to leave Hungary. Russian military was stationed in Hungary, and they demanded that the Russians leave Hungary. And they turned against the communist regime. The day it started, on October 23, there was something unusual in the air. And I went down, and there were a lot of people marching, going somewhere. I don't know. I didn't know exactly what's happening. Being a curious kid of 16, I followed them. In front of the Parliament House, across the Danube, on the Buda side, back again on the Pest side, and they stopped in front of the Parliament. And they wanted one of the old politicians to come out and take care and be in charge of the revolution. By then it was night, and they turned off the lights, and people got on our newspapers and crunched it up and lit up, so the whole place was lit up for newspapers. Obviously not for long. The lights came back, there was some talk, and it was getting late, so I went home. I wake up in the morning, getting ready for school. My uncle asked, "Where do you think you're going?" I said, "I'm going to school." He said, "No, you're not, there's a revolution." So for quite some time we stayed at home, we couldn't go out. We had enough food at home to eat for a while, and finally the Russians left. The revolution won. So there were a few days when fighting stopped and people were over the streets celebrating. Shortly after that, the Russian army came back, and the revolution they won over the revolution. There were terrible fights, and tanks came and destroyed buildings, so Budapest looked like after the war. During the communist regime, they sealed off the borders, so no one could escape. They didn't give exit passports to anyone, so people in Hungary had to stay in Hungary. As Churchill said after the Second World War, the Iron Curtain has descended. So I was 16, that was before the revolution. I met a young girl, same age, and she was beautiful, and I was in love with her. Came the revolution, came the Russians attacking Budapest. She volunteered to carry wounded soldiers to the hospital. And one of the, or wounded people rather, and one of the people they collected was a wounded Russian soldier. And when they got to the hospital, the people wanted to lynch the soldier. And she, a 16-year-old girl, said, "You can't do that. He's a wounded soldier," and saved his life. Once the Russians won, a lot of people who participated in the revolution were court-martialed, and she was court-martialed. And she explained her case and had the Russian soldiers' contact, and he vouched for her that she saved his life, and she was let go. During the revolution, the border guards decided not to guard the borders. So there was an opportunity to escape. A lot of people took that opportunity. Women were hugging and kissing the border guards. It was an unbelievable scene. I was 16, and I can still see it in my mind.
And so you spent some time in Switzerland.
Yes.
What made you come to Australia eventually?
Well, we lived in Switzerland, and we were settling in Switzerland. They allowed us to stay in Switzerland, and they looked after us extremely well. The first few weeks we were in a military camp, and no one could leave. I think they were watching out for communists or people who got out of jail. The Swiss people were just unbelievable. In the morning they brought in a lot of cheese, hot chocolate, bread, butter. They looked for Hungarians who could cook to make sure they're cooking Hungarian food. At one point, a young man came to the camp looking for Hungarian refugees that he could help. And he just pulled out a card. It happened to be our name. He introduced himself and he said, "I'm here to help you." There was an article in a Hungarian newspaper that the Australian government accepts refugees. So the family got together discussing, should we stay or should we come to Australia? We had friends in Australia, we wrote to them, and they wrote exactly what the life is here. The good, the bad, the difficulties. And we said, that sounds good enough for us. So we applied, we got accepted, and the Australian government brought us out, flew us out from Switzerland to Australia.
Maybe you could tell us how old you were when you arrived in Australia and what your experience was like going into high school, speaking I take it no English or very little English?
Well, it was May 1957, so I wasn't even 17 when we arrived. And after a while, we settled down, and the family rented a place in Summerhill, and I started to go to school. I went to Homebush High, spoke a few words of English, but not much. And slowly, I picked up English and started to listen to what's going on. So once my English has improved, at the end of year 4, so between May and November 57, I passed all subjects except English. I got 20% in English. I went to one of my English teachers. I said, "Look, can you give me some more homework because I'm really struggling?" He said, "Yeah, no problem. I'll give you some homework, but you won't pass." It was not a smart comment, but I resolved that I will pass. And I got a retired English teacher who was helping me, and I dropped some of the honors subject I was doing. At the end of year 5, I passed all subjects. So I applied for a part-time university study. I managed to get it, so I was working for the British Motor Corporation during the day. They put me through a training school. At night I attended university, and I got a modest weekly income, but it covered all my expenses, and that enabled me to contribute to our family's living costs. After 2 years, I managed to get a full-time cadetship, and that was for the Department of Civil Aviation. And we suddenly felt that Australia is the best country. Not easy, certainly not easy for my parents. For my father, very difficult. He had 7 heart attacks. His English wasn't good. After one of his heart attacks, he was kicked out of the job, which wouldn't have happened today. And he never regretted coming to Australia.
What was it like starting a new life in Australia? What were some of the things that you really had to, I suppose, surprised you and that required the most adjustment?
There were difficulties and there were wonderful moments. And we chose the right country. And Australia is still the best country. If you were to ask me, or people ask me, what are you? The answer is, I'm Australian. I was born in Hungary. It's that simple.
In closing, I'd like to say that this year Australia will receive the 1 millionth refugee since 1947. And I wonder, do you have any reflections personally on Australia accepting refugees and the fact that Australia has now welcomed the 1 millionth person since 1947?
I think it's right that Australia accepts refugees, and many of the refugees contributed to Australian life and accepted Australian life, and that's good to see. And at the same time, a lot of them maintained their origin, their culture, but settled down and became Australians. I'm very happy to be here and meet all sorts of people coming from various parts of life. And there's something common going through all that. Living in Australia and being an Australian.